All right, Sakina, let me hand it over to you because schooling, of course, is the most important issue as all grades make their way back to school today, but a little bit of reservation from some unions. Let's get that interview from you.
Indeed, Leanne. Well, most grades will return to school this week after a 4-week break. Now, grades R, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, 10 and 11 will be phased in, while grades 5 and 8 will return on the 31st of August. Basic Education Minister Angie Motshekga released directions and also regulations for learning shortly after President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the closure of schools due to the increase in COVID-19 infections in July. So to discuss this matter further, we're joined by Basil Manuel, who's the Executive Director of the National Professional Teachers Organization of South Africa, or NAPTOSA. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Welcome to Morning Live, Mr. Manuel.
Absolute pleasure to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
The Department of Education says all systems go. We are ready. And one of your union counterparts, NAPTOSA, saying that if you go out, you will indeed find that most rural schools are not quite ready to return. What's NAPTOSA's assessment of the situation?
In fact, we may not be wrong to assume that there may be big gaps. However, the ministry has given an undertaking, and it would be a tragic betrayal of parents, of children and of teachers if indeed they are misleading the public. So today we will reassess and we will look at it again. But certainly by Monday last, many schools indicated that they were doubtful that they would have the requisite PPEs, cleaning materials, and the teachers, more importantly, to continue the year.
So over the past few weeks, with grades 12 and 7 attending classes, how have schools been able to maintain the health protocols as per requirements? And what has been your assessment of how that's gone as well?
Because of the limited number of children at school, that has actually gone off quite well. But now remember, we are talking about 2 million children back as opposed to 10 million children back today throughout the country. And that's a huge difference. And measuring up to that increased number, that is going to be the big challenge. And so that is why today is such a critical day.
So you spoke about the gaps that may be there. You spoke about concerns that you've already noted. And with this huge cohort of children returning back to class today, what are some of your concerns and anxieties as NAPTOSA?
Of course, primary is the protection of our teachers and our children, whether the masks have been delivered, whether the cleaning materials have been delivered. But there's another big issue, and that is the replacement of teachers that are off on comorbidities. We've had approximately 13% of those we've surveyed indicate to us that they don't think they would be able to formulate a timetable because they simply don't have enough teachers at school. Now, if 13% is a sample, that means about 2,000 schools are saying that they won't be able to formulate a timetable. And that becomes critical because parents are sending children to school. We want the children at school. But then if we can't continue with learning and teaching, then that's a huge problem for us.
But one would imagine that the department would have that particular situation under control because those teachers had, of course, applied to the department to be exempt from attending class. What has been the situation since those requirements came into place, since those exemptions were asked from the department?
Sakina, let's recognize that it's an enormously expensive exercise. And so the attempt has been to try and limit the expenditure. So whilst there was a limited number of learners at school, other teachers have been asked to fill in. And that seems to have worked in most places. However, now that we have the large cohort of kids returning, that is not going to work. And that is why we need those appointments. To date, we've only seen meaningful movement in 2 of our 9 provinces to get the replacements done on time. And that's most disconcerting.
So what's the point then in moving learners back if indeed you do not have the teaching staff in place to continue with teaching?
That's our concern. Now, I don't want to create the impression that it's in every school. As I said, the critical areas are in your secondary schools, in your maths and sciences, and of course also where they are a large cluster of teachers off at a particular school. But we need these replaced. And of course, by assuring the public that schools are ready, we are actually saying that all this is in place. And that is why at the beginning I said it would be a betrayal of the trust of our people if, in fact, we have these huge
Well, our apologies there. It just seemed to have frozen that particular line to Basil Manuel there. And we're speaking to NAPTOSA as most grades of learners return to school today. And as you can hear, there are some concerns, especially with teachers who have expressed that they may have comorbidities. Mr. Manuel saying that 13% of teachers actually applied for exemption because of comorbidities. So we'll continue this conversation with him to find out exactly what the way forward is. What is the solution? And with grades 12 and 7 having been back in class and continuing learning and teaching, Mr. Manuel indicating there that that was a much smaller cohort of children to contend with, 2 million as opposed to the 10 million that are expected to be back at school today. So I believe we have Mr. Basil Manuel back. So let's continue the conversation. Mr. Manuel, just getting back to the issues that we were discussing, let's pick up with the teachers with comorbidities who have applied for exemption. 13% of teachers, you said. So of those 13% of teachers, do we know how many of those are above the age of 60?
Not really. We have an indication, but there would be a substantial number above the age of 60. But remember, illness is not limited to people over the age of 60. So we are talking about in the realm of about 15,000 teachers. And those are the figures that we have been given by the department. Of course, the 13% I'm mentioning is schools unable to formulate timetables.
So with those teachers above the age of 60, what is the explanation of why those teachers have not entered retirement as yet?
Remember, our compulsory retirement age is 65. And of course, many teachers have breaks in service and they go to the age of 65. And this would ordinarily be okay. Nobody thought that we would be sitting with something like COVID-19, which would endanger them specifically, but it would also be unfair now to demand that they suddenly make a change and retire simply because they may not have planned for it. Remember, retirement is a thing that you don't enter into very, very lightly. So we are watching the situation, and we certainly hope that with the downward turn in the number of infections, that these folk will be back with us very soon, because as soon as we get to level 1, the teachers will return. But as of now, they're not there, and that is why we need to ensure that they are certainly replaced, because we can't run our schools without them.
And then looking at the curriculum and covering the curriculum across the grades, let's start with grade 12, because they have been in school, as have been the grade 7s. So in terms of grade 12, with that exit exam at the end of the year, what are we looking at there in terms of the expectations? And with regard to the rate of curriculum coverage at this stage, how much of that curriculum do you believe has been covered in general by grade 12s?
Sakina, I can only go by the survey that we conducted that ended last week, Monday. And one of the questions was a question to schools to ask them if indeed they believe that they would have covered the entire curriculum by the time the exam begins. And of course, a large proportion, almost 60% of our secondary schools that participated, indicated that they had doubts. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by this, because in fact, when you think about it, the vast majority of our schools couldn't teach during the hard lockdown. And the result was that, of course, we then had, almost 70% of our learners off for 3 months of the year. And of course, that had a major impact on their ability to finish the curriculum. So now we are saying the Department of Education needs to be clear about the examination, what it is on, and whether we are limiting the examination. Because when we talk about the psychological health of our children, you can imagine the pressure those matriculants are under and the difficulty with saying to somebody, catch up 3 months. So what we are saying is that let's be clear about the examination so that we attend to the psychological health, particularly of the child that is not as resilient as other children are, that is mentally resilient. And we know that there are thousands of those children. So there is a crisis there.
And with regard to the other grades, grades R to 11, because the department seemed very clear that it will not be a pass one, pass all situation. So same question in terms of curriculum coverage. And again, I think one of the factors that we cannot get away from, Mr. Manuel, is the inequality that exists and how this has come into play.
Absolutely. COVID has exposed the inequality in our system. It has, in fact, almost enhanced it. And it showed you that there were a number of schools that could continue working, but of course 70% of our kids could not. And yes, we want to get a credible amount of work done so that we can assess children and that we can credibly say that these children have been passed based on work done. However, there are many obstacles. If schools are not ready, if there are interruptions, we are going to have to assess as we go along. Up to now, the DBE has not published the pass requirements, or rather the progression requirements for this year. And we need to have those out because we need schools to see what needs to be done in order to have children move from one grade to the next. But I don't think one can summarily just say we are not going to be interested in looking at progression with a relaxed set of requirements. I think it is an essential because the rest of the world would have done that. And we are no different to the rest of the world.
And just finally, having canvassed your members, are there any particular areas of concern where you fear school might not open today as a result of non-compliance with the PPE and other COVID-19 regulations?
Let's accept that today is going to be a major, major happening. When you think about 10 million children descending on the school, KwaZulu-Natal is the only province, to my knowledge, that has actually stated that learners must come in batches between today and Friday so that you alleviate the crush today. But teachers are going to have a major uphill battle, scanning kids, recording their health record, etc. So a big portion of the day is going to be spent on administration and then, of course, also getting the children to understand the timetable, particularly the 50% return requirement that there is for social distancing. And our teachers are fearful of the sheer number of children that they have to be in close contact with without them having been scanned or anything like that happening. That is a given. And also, of course, they will be accompanied by parents, and that heightens the concerns. But our teachers are ready for the day. They know that a lot is being expected of them today, and they certainly have committed to ensuring that today runs smoothly. So now we hold our breaths and we hope that everything actually happens as suggested.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Basil Manuel, Executive Director of the National Professional Teachers Organization of South Africa, NAPTOSA, talking to us about the state of readiness of our schools as most grades return to school today. Let's take a break, and on the other side of that, we'll continue with some of our regular features on the show.